From 12 News, this is Newsmakers.
The first 100 days of President Donald Trump's second administration are in the books, and it's been a whirlwind. From huge tariff increases to immigration raids and leaked signal chats, Democrats have been finding more opportunities to go on offense. But they face their own divides, including whether it's time for generational change across party leadership. We'll ask about that and much more with our guest this week on Newsmakers, Massachusetts Congressman Jake Auchincloss. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White alongside 12 News Politics editor Ted Nesi, and we welcome our guest, Congressman from Massachusetts, Jake Auchincloss. Congressman, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me back.
So, as you heard there, just so much we could start with. But I do want to begin with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. He's been in the news again, and particularly want to hear your perspective on it because you served in the U.S. Marines, Afghanistan, Panama as well, I think,
yes.
Right? Okay. So, want your perspective. More reporting that he again shared sensitive information on the encrypted messenger app Signal. You have said, quote, the man needs to be fired. And look, Congressman, there are a lot of people watching right now who may believe that's an overreaction steeped in politics. What do you say to them?
The frame that greets every new officer candidate at Quantico, Virginia, is leadership by example. And what Pete Hegseth has done is establish double standards and apply them to himself in a way that is corrosive to esprit de corps and good order and discipline within the ranks. Every single individual within the Pentagon, every single uniformed individual knows that if they were a captain or a corporal who did what he did, they'd be fired.
So you think it's hurting morale within the ranks? Do you have any proof of that happening?
Because I was a Marine officer myself, and anybody who has read the UCMJ knows that the Uniform Code of Military Justice would require that an individual that shares in the clear classified war plans, that's it, that's their end of their career. And what he is doing is saying one rule for you, one rule for me, and that's corrosive to morale. It's not just bad, by the way, for our domestic readiness. It makes us look like amateurs to our adversaries. The Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans, the Chinese, they send hardened apparatchiks to these negotiations. And they look across the table and they see Hegseth, they see Tulsi Gabbard, they see J.D. Vance, and it looks like we're sending our JV squad.
Before I ask my first question, I want to apologize to the viewers for my hoarse voice as I get over a cold I believe my toddler gifted to me. So Democrats, Congressman, have a very long list of things they're concerned about that the Trump administration has done in its first 100 days. As Tim said in the open, tariffs, international relations. Do you have a number one concern? Do you have something among all the noise, all the headlines everyone is seeing that you fear is most damaging?
The rule of law and freedom. Freedom means that if your feet are on American soil, that the state can't mess with you without demonstrating in front of a judge that you have committed a crime beyond reasonable doubt. And what the president is doing is he is basically saying due process is a privilege that I can bestow on Americans. That's not how it works. And that is why we must take so seriously the abrogations of habeas corpus and due process against people like Garcia and other immigrants here. And Ted, I know that this president wants to fight Democrats on immigration. Let's look at the politics.
That was going to be my next question. He wants you talking about this?
I get it. I know he does. And candidly, the challenges at the border under Joe Biden have made immigration a tough issue for Democrats, but we cannot waver from our values. Equal justice under law is the core of what freedom means to Americans, and this president is arguing that he's now going to do it next to American citizens. We have to draw a sharp line. The courts need to use criminal and civil contempt.
How is he saying he's going to do this lack of due process to American citizens?
He called it, when he met with the El Salvadorian president in the Oval Office, he said next up will be, quote, homegrown criminals. Well, another word for homegrown under the 14th Amendment is citizen of the United States. What you can see him doing next is saying, well, you know, these journalists, these political opponents, these civil society leaders, they're getting really frustrating. And now I am going to send them to CCOT in El Salvador. And anybody who's listening to this to think that, oh, that can't happen here in America, this is the slippery slope that authoritarians use to impugn upon our freedom as Americans. It's not about border security. I have favored bipartisan border security my whole tenure in Congress. It is about freedom for Americans.
How do you think the rule of law is holding up so far? Because I was reading something in the Wall Street Journal editorial page recently, which raised concerns from the right about due process, but said so far the administration is more or less going along with the judges. Do you believe that? Do you think they are truly flouting the courts yet?
The area that I see the impending constitutional crisis is with their ignoring the Supreme Court's and the lower court's order to bring Garcia back home, which is why these courts should, if necessary, use the U.S. Marshal Service to go get him and bring him back and give him due process.
That would be an extraordinary step.
It would be an extraordinary and yet a necessary step. An order from a court is not a recommendation, it's not a request, it is an order that the president must follow. And this is the challenge we're facing right now, is that the founders very wisely envisioned a tripartite system of government where Congress and the president and the judiciary would all be battling one another. Ambition would counteract ambition, in Madison's words. The problem is Speaker Johnson, Senate Majority Leader John Thune, they don't think of themselves as leaders of a separate and co-equal branch of government. They think of themselves as MAGA courtiers. So they have marginalized Congress. The courts are fighting Trump one-on-one, and we have to get Congress off the sidelines and into this fight. That means building public pressure on vulnerable Republicans, and most of all, it means winning the midterms.
Let's bring up a social media post from President Trump. It's a rare rebuke of Vladimir Putin by the president. This after an attack in Ukraine's capital city killed more than a dozen people. Trump took to social media and wrote, "Vladimir, stop," saying that he was, quote, "not happy with the Russian strikes, not necessary, and very bad timing." What do you make of it?
The normal eloquence from our president. 50 years ago, Ronald Reagan said to his leadership team, it's simple about the Cold War. We win, they lose. What Donald Trump is doing is saying they win, we lose. And from that basic premise is why we are seeing this negotiation out of weakness. And Vladimir Putin smells that weakness, and he is going to take advantage of it. The way to negotiate against a dictator in the Kremlin is to say the following. One, Ukraine is going to get your 300 billion euros that are held in Brussels. We're going to use those 300 billion euros to fund over the next decade a 1 million-man army to secure its eastern border and to fund its military-industrial complex. We're going to guarantee it freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, and it's going to enter the European Union and take advantage of the Collective Defense Treaty under the EU's Lisbon Treaty. Now, Russia, knowing all of this, knowing these guarantees for Ukraine's security, what do you want to put on the table? That is strength. What Trump is doing is weakness.
So you don't sense a shift from him through a social media post criticizing Vladimir Putin at all?
No, he has given Russia right off the bat everything that it could want. No NATO membership for Ukraine, Crimea belongs to Russia, and nothing about the frozen assets in Brussels. You do not grant your counterparty all of their negotiating asks ahead of the negotiation. This guy is not a deal maker. He's a dupe.
So we're going to bounce all over because there's so much going on. I'm going to bounce back to domestic policy. You, at the beginning of this Congress, landed a plum spot on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and that's the center of the action on this big fight over up to $880 billion in Medicaid cuts that the Republican leaders are looking at as part of their tax cut package. I've seen a lot of reporting about queasiness among moderate Republicans about that level of cut. You know, you're on the committee. What's your sense of, could they go that far on Medicaid reductions? Do you think it's going to get pulled back by the moderate Republicans?
I don't know. Here's what I do know. They are going to add $6.9 trillion to the national debt over the next decade, which we will all pay for through higher taxes and through inflation. And they're adding that debt in order to cut taxes for people who don't need tax cuts. They're going to also try to cut health care for people who do need health care, particularly for seniors who need at-home care under Medicaid, and for the 40 to 50% of American children who rely on Medicaid. And they're touching a hot stove as they do that. And this is what Democrats need to be laser focused on. It is the poor stewardship of the economy under Donald Trump, where the Dow Jones has had its worst April since the Great Depression, and where people are watching their 401ks plummet. Meanwhile, he's meeting with his meme coin investors for a grand dinner. And the fact that they have abandoned all fiscal responsibility in pursuit of tax cuts for the wealthy and well-connected.
Briefly, before we go to a commercial break, when I think about one policy is Medicaid cuts that the administration that they're looking at. You have the cuts to the NIH, and some of which is in court right now, and grants and all of that. You look at they're going after Harvard, your alma mater, and a lot of that is replicated, I should say, in Rhode Island. They're going after Brown as well, and the research institutions down here. How big a threat do you see all of that to sort of the foundation of the regional economy, which is a lot of it's based on huge amounts of money flowing into the healthcare system?
It's a significant threat to the eds and meds enterprise of New England, and as you said, particularly to Greater Boston. It is basic research. It is the scientific integrity of the regulators. It is the corruption within HHS right now. And you've got RFK and his henchmen claiming that they are these oracles of wisdom about chronic disease, and they alone can make America healthy. Well, it turns out that all of RFK's top people have side businesses that are regulated and reimbursed by CMS. You've got Callie Means, you've got Brad Smith. These people are corrupt in addition to being incompetent, and that's going to make Americans less healthy, and it's going to further erode confidence in our gold standard regulations for biomedical research. This is actually a bigger threat than the funding freezes.
All right, we're going to take a break on the program. Coming up next is what's on the horizon for the congressman, and is he eyeing a big promotion next year? Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. This is Ted Nesi. Our guest this week is Congressman Jake Auchincloss. Ted?
Let's cut right to it. Are you considering a primary challenge to Senator Markey next year?
I am running for re-election to be the member of Congress from the Massachusetts 4th. To the sense that I am looking at flipping seats, it is the swing seats in the House of Representatives that will give Hakeem Jeffries the Speaker's gavel. Because if we're going to lame duck Donald Trump, we have to take the House of Representatives back. My leadership PAC, Beyond Thoughts and Prayers, has surged resources, both field and financial, to swing district Democrats in the last 2 cycles, and I'm going to do so again.
So will you rule out running in the primary against Senator Markey?
I don't close doors. What I am focused on right now is my own re-election and on helping vulnerable Democrats, whether seeking re-election in hard seats or trying to take out Republicans that can give us the majority.
Are there people encouraging you to look at a Senate run?
There are, I've done 16 town halls throughout my district. What I'm hearing from my constituents is that Trump is the issue, Trump is the problem, Trump has to be the focus.
Let's say hypothetically a young congressman wanted to run for U.S. Senate against an incumbent. When would you advise that young congressman to make up his mind once and for all?
I don't engage in hypotheticals. I engage in the present and urgent reality that Democrats have to take back the majority if we are going to truly turn Donald Trump into a lame duck for the second half of his administration. And my focus for the Democratic Party is how we can be a party that can have a sustainable majority going forward. Because to the extent that we are polling at 27% nationally in terms of our favorables, we're not a party that's going to be able to defeat MAGA. We've got to stop condescending to voters. The worst example of this was our attitude towards parents during the school closures. We have got to start putting forward an agenda that can truly lower costs, particularly in housing and energy and healthcare. And we've got to continue defending the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and, of course, domestic.
One more on this, and I promise I'm not trying to be cute in this one, but DNC Vice Chair David Hogg, who was in Rhode Island last night for a fundraiser, actually, he's gotten a lot of blowback after saying he's going to spend $20 million primarying Democrats he views as older and ineffective. This is a big conversation, whatever happens with any Senate race with you and Ed Markey or none. What do you make of the frustration that's clearly out there to some degree about the hold on a lot of big jobs that the older generation in your party has?
Generational dynamism is a good thing. Dynamism, though, is not just about people. And sometimes I think we focus too much on people. I hear this a lot. Oh, we need a new leader, right? We need new ideas. We need big and bold ideas as a party. As a party, over the last decade, we have exhausted ourselves battling against MAGA. And that is a righteous fight, but it is one that has depleted some of our intellectual vitality. We got to get out there and talk about, hey, we're going to build 7 million housing units across this country in the next decade to lower housing costs. We're going to build 5 Hoover Dams worth of nuclear power. We're going to take on the health insurance corporations that are price gouging small businesses and patients. We're going to peel the bark off the social media corporations that have been attention fracking our kids, corroding our civil discourse, and making money off tribalism. Like, let's talk about the policy agenda for the future. The politicians and the ambition, it'll always be there.
That's why his title is politics editor, Congressman, if you haven't gathered that. All right, look, you touched on this in the first half of the program. Ted mentioned you're a Harvard alum. You obviously do not agree with the Trump administration's choking off of funds to Harvard and other universities. I get that. But let me ask you this. Do you agree with those on the right that say Harvard and other universities, the majority, are hostile environments for conservative viewpoints, and that needs to change?
Yes, and I've said that really my entire tenure in Congress.
So what's happening on campuses where it's like that?
Harvard's telos, what's on its shield is the word truth. And if you're going to pursue truth, you have to be independent from politics. You got to be independent from the progressive orthodoxies of the left, independent of authoritarian impulses on the right. You've got to pursue truth without fear or favor. Harvard was captured by the left. It is now being bullied by the right, and it has to, I think, fight back against both. I think President Alan Garber is actually doing a good job of that. And what's fascinating, if you'd asked me this 2 years ago, I would have found it unbelievable, is that Harvard might become a long pole in the tent of civil society's opposition to Donald Trump.
Before we go to break, kind of pivoting back to politics, and Ted, in his line of questioning to you, why have Democrats seemingly lost a lot of working class voters? And it's a big question, but I'm sure you've thought a lot about that after the presidential election.
You represent Fall River, first time voting for a Republican president in 100 years.
100 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
In a word, condescension.
From your party?
Yes.
Okay, and how do you fix that?
Stop it. Stop talking down to people and start offering solutions, particularly economic solutions, that directly affect their cost of living. The number one overarching economic trend of the last 5 years is people feel like their paychecks are not keeping up with the cost of living, particularly in housing and utilities and healthcare. The Republicans are making it worse with their tariffs chaos. If Democrats have a crystal clear, compelling agenda for how we'll make it better, we can win. But people will only hear those economic ideas if we stop condescending to them on social and cultural issues.
All right, we're going to take a break, and I do want to touch on housing when we get back. The congressman has said at least Massachusetts should take a more muscular approach to housing. We'll talk about that when we come back. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. This is Ted Nesi. Our guest is Massachusetts Congressman Jake Auchincloss. Congressman, you have said Massachusetts will have to take a, quote, more muscular action to facilitate construction of hundreds of thousands or thousands of new housing units in the next decade to meet demand. What does that mean? What does a more muscular action to housing development mean?
It means we have to build 250,000 units of housing in the next decade if we are going to offer enough supply to meaningfully lower prices.
Just in Mass?
Just in Massachusetts alone. The pace of production that we're on currently is about 10% of that. What that means is that people's rents are going to keep on going up. If you're frustrated that your landlord keeps on raising your rent, the only way to stop that is to give your landlord more competition by building more housing units. That requires zoning and regulatory reform. So it means changing Chapter 40B regulations. It means...
For our Rhode Islanders, that's a thing that can force more affordable housing to be built in Massachusetts if you haven't reached a metric.
That's right. Changing some of the building permitting that is overly restrictive, so making it easier to build those 3 to 10 unit missing middle style apartments that are, maybe not architecturally glamorous, but they're affordable. They're the workhorse of affordability for housing, and they were what gave the working class a ladder into cities.
Even in Newton, even in Brookline,
especially in the places that have most resisted it. Now you're going to see there's a power law here where 80% of the new housing units are probably going to be in 20% of the cities, and that's fine and normal. So you want to pick your spots. The most important spots to pick may end up being actually sites that don't have any housing. There are state-owned sites, whether it's decommissioned military bases or decommissioned prisons or brownfield sites, where the state can directly zone for high-density housing at scale and make a meaningful dent in our housing production needs.
How much do you think, we just had the new stats on the birth rate down at historic lows ever since the Great Recession. Right. You've done your part, you have multiple kids, but what do you think, the Trump administration's talked about giving like $5,000 to families to have another baby. What do you think, since we're talking about my generation, frankly, what do you think would actually move the needle policy-wise to get people to have bigger families?
It's useful to look at other countries that have tried this. South Korea, Germany, Italy have all had pronatal policies that are based on basically reimbursing families. None of them have shown any actual meaningful change in fertility rates. So I think what we have to start the conversation with saying is there's no known policy intervention, but policymakers, regardless of how many kids a family has, should make it easier to have kids. So make housing more affordable, make childcare more affordable, and Massachusetts is actually doing great stuff with the direct-to-provider grants, and take on the social media corporations that are monetizing children's attention spans and basically turning them into a product to be sold off to the highest bidder.
Social media is the cause or part of the cause for low birth rates?
I don't think social media is the cause for low birth rates. I'm saying that we want to make it better and easier to have kids and to be a family. And right now, screen time is devouring family time. And as policymakers, we should be putting families ahead of these corporations.
You have been outspoken on a somewhat wonky issue, PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers, the middlemen who help insurers figure out drug prices. One of the biggest ones in the country is CVS Health with their Caremark division, which is right up the road from where we're taping today. Is CVS a bad actor in that world in your view?
Yes, it is a prime example of corporate capture that's inflating prices. They are, and I challenged the Caremark CEO on this in Congress last year. They are marking up drugs for multiple sclerosis, for leukemia, for HIV by thousands of a percent, all for their own profit margin. They are bullying small independent pharmacists, and they are distorting the pharmaceutical supply chain in a way that's both bad for innovation and bad for patients and families.
CVS says they are also bringing down costs and that they're one of the only things to prevent just constant cost inflation from the providers, from the drug companies.
It's a famous talking point from them. So I oftentimes will assert that I actually think PBMs are necessary. We need pharmacy benefit managers because you have to negotiate against pharma. You got to set formularies. You got to do claims processing and reimbursement processing. My question is, why is that a $300 billion enterprise? That's like a couple lines of software code. And in fact, there's a number of disruptor PBMs that are flat rate per member per month, fully transparent. What has happened with the big three, Caremark, Cigna, and United Health Group, is that they ensconce themselves in the middle of the supply chain. It's very opaque, it's very complicated. They got really comfy there, and they started rent seeking and taking more and more and more money out of that. And that money is coming from small businesses and patients.
All right, we have about a minute left, Congressman, so I'm going to ask you this one, and it's, for context, Robert Kraft is one of your constituents. Gillette Stadium is in your district. A personal priority for the president is a tax hike for mega wealthy people who own professional sports teams. Do you support or oppose that?
I don't know the policy in detail well enough. What I absolutely support is a more progressive tax code, which is the opposite of what Republicans are doing right now. They are going to give massive tax cuts to the 1%, something like 50 to 80% of all the benefits.
Well, they'll say, we don't want to tax tips. We don't want to tax, Social Security benefits. We don't want to tax overtime.
They're throwing that in there to mask and obscure what they're actually doing, which is 50 to 80% of the benefits of this tax cut are going to the 1%. And that is going to come out of the middle class, because ultimately that $7 trillion of debt that's getting added to the national debt, that is paid for with inflation or with higher taxes. There is no free lunch in fiscal policy.
All right, 20 seconds. So you don't think what I just laid out is a possibility? That's not going to be part of the budget reconciliation, those tax cuts?
That budget reconciliation is going to be purely partisan. It'll be GOP only, so you got to ask them how they're going to hook up the wealthy and well-connected.
Congressman Jake Auchincloss, thank you very much for joining us on the program. If you missed any of it, it's on WPRI.com. For Ted Nesi, I'm Tim White. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.